My name is Elias. I live in a small, weathered bungalow on the outskirts of a dying mining town in Nevada. Out here, the wind is the only neighbor you can count on, and the desert has a way of swallowing sounds before they can reach the next house. I'm a man of simple routines. I check my perimeter, I lock my doors at 9 p.m., and I never answer the door after the sun has dipped below the jagged line of the Sierras. It's a lonely life, but in the desert, loneliness is a form of protection. 2 weeks ago, on a Tuesday that felt as heavy and dry as a kiln, the routine broke. I was sitting in my armchair, the only light coming from a small reading lamp, when a sound vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the settling of the house. It was a knock. 3 slow, rhythmic raps on my front door. Thud, thud, thud. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. No one comes out here. Not the mailman, not the sheriff, and certainly not a friend. I stayed perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the shadow beneath the door. Elias? We're lost. Can we come in and use your phone? The voice was thin, high-pitched, and unnaturally flat. It was the voice of a child, maybe 10 or 11 years old, but it lacked the inflection of youth. It sounded like a recording of a child played back through a filter of static. I didn't answer. I reached for the heavy flashlight on the side table, but I didn't turn it on. Elias, please. It's so cold out here. Our parents are coming. We just need to call them. Just open the door a little bit. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. I could see my breath blooming in the air, a white ghost in the lamplight. My house has thick walls, but I could hear their breathing, not the quick, shallow breaths of a scared child, but a slow, synchronized rasp that sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. I walked to the window beside the door, pulling back the heavy curtain just an inch. There were 2 of them, a boy and a girl, standing side by side on my porch. They were dressed in clothes that looked like they belonged in a Sears catalog from 1,955 stiff wool coats and polished shoes that showed no dust from the desert road. They were pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, and their heads were bowed, hiding their faces in the shadows. I don't have a phone, I said, my voice sounding like gravel. Go back to the main road. There's a station 5 miles up. The boy lifted his head. In the pale silver light of the moon, I saw them. He didn't have irises. He didn't have pupils. His eyes were solid, light-absorbing pits of ink. They weren't just black. They were a void. Looking into them felt like looking off the edge of a cliff in the middle of a starless night. We can't go to the road, Elias, the boy said. His lips didn't move in sync with the words. We need to be invited. Just let us in. It won't take long. We just want to see the light. The girl lifted her head then, and her eyes were the same twin abysses that seemed to pull the light out of the room. She smiled, and her teeth were too white, too many, and far too sharp. I pulled the curtain shut, my hands trembling so violently that the fabric hissed against the glass. I backed away from the window, but the image of those eyes, those hungry, infinite voids, remained burned into my retinas. They didn't just look at me. They felt like they were pouring something cold and heavy into my mind. Elias, we can see you behind the cloth. The boy's voice drifted through the wood. It was louder now, as if the door were made of paper instead of solid oak. The curtain is just a thin skin. It doesn't hide your heart. I retreated into the kitchen, fumbling for the light switch. I flipped it. Nothing. The bulb didn't just fail. I heard the filament snap with a tiny crystalline ping. I tried the lamp in the hallway. Same result. One by one, the lights in my house were dying, extinguished by a presence that seemed to feed on electricity. The knocking started again. But it wasn't on the front door anymore. Thud, Thud. Thud. It came from the kitchen window. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. There was no one outside the glass, just the vast, indifferent desert. But the sound continued. Thud. 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 Now it was coming from the floorboards beneath my feet, then from the ceiling. They were surrounding the house, but not in a physical way. They were surrounding my perception. Elias? The air is getting thin in there, isn't it? The girl's voice was right behind me. I whirled around, swinging the heavy mag light. The hallway was empty, but the smell was unmistakable. It was the scent of wet soot, an old stagnant ozone, the smell of a fire that had been put out a long time ago. I didn't invite you, I screamed, my voice cracking. You have no right. Get off my property. Property is a human lie, Elias, the boy replied. I could hear him pacing on the porch, his footsteps sounding like dry bones clicking together. We don't want your house. We want the warmth. You've been hoarding it for so long. All that life, just sitting in the dark. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my nose. I reached up and felt something wet. Blood. It was a slow, thick trickle, identical to the acoustic trauma I'd experienced in the woods. But this was different. This was the result of a psychic pressure, a weight on my brain that was trying to force me to do the one thing I knew would be my end. I looked at the front door. My hand began to move toward the deadbolt. It wasn't my will, it was my muscles acting on their own, responding to a frequency I couldn't hear. Just a little crack, Elias, the children said in unison, their voices perfectly synced, just enough for the shadow to breathe. I fought it. I grabbed my right wrist with my left hand, gasping as I struggled against my own body. I forced myself toward the kitchen, toward the heavy iron stove. I needed a distraction. I needed a different kind of routine. I grabbed a cast iron skillet and slammed it against the countertop. Clang. The sound was a jagged edge in the unnatural silence. The pressure in my head flickered for a second. I did it again. Clang. Clang. You don't like noise, do you? I gritted my teeth, the blood now dripping onto my shirt. You like the quiet. You like the whisper. Well, not tonight. The knocking on the walls grew frantic, a chaotic drumming that sounded like 1,000 hailstones hitting the house. The house began to groan, the timber shrieking under a weight that shouldn't be there. And then the front door, the heavy, locked, bolted door, began to glow. Not with light, but with a dark, pulsating aura that made the wood look like it was rotting in real time. The door is tired, Elias, the girl whispered, and I could feel her breath on the back of my neck, even though the hallway was empty. It wants to be a mouth. The iron skillet felt like it weighed 100 pounds, but it was the only thing keeping the static in my brain from turning into a total blackout. Every time I slammed it against the counter, the dark aura around the front door flinched, retreating for a split second before pulsing back with even more intensity. But the house was failing me. I looked at the hallway walls. The floral wallpaper, which had been there since I bought the place in '88, was curling and blackening. It wasn't burning, it was wilting. Underneath the paper, the lath and plaster were turning into something that looked like gray, porous bone. My home was becoming a skeleton. Elias, the house is just a body. The boy's voice came from the vents now. It was wet, gurgling, as if the air ducts were filled with mud. And like any body, it has holes. Why do you struggle to keep the skin intact? I backed into the living room, my flashlight beam flickering. The shadows in the corners weren't staying in the corners anymore. They were stretching out, reaching for my boots like long, ink-stained fingers. I shined the light at the ceiling and my breath hitched. The two children were there. They weren't standing on the floor. They were standing on the ceiling, their polished shoes stuck to the plaster as if gravity were a suggestion they chose to ignore. Their heads were hanging down, their necks elongated and twisting at impossible angles to look at me. Those eyes. Up close, they weren't just black. I could see depth in them, miles and miles of empty, starless space. I felt a pull, a literal physical suction, trying to draw my consciousness into those ink pits. "We're already inside, Elias," the girl whispered. Her hair hung down like a curtain of dead silk, brushing against the top of my head. It felt like cold needles. The invitation was in your fear. Every time your heart skipped a beat, you opened a window. I swung the mag light at her, but the heavy metal passed right through her torso as if she were made of smoke. She didn't flinch. She just giggled a sound that was a perfect, chilling mimicry of a wind chime in a graveyard. "You're not real," I choked out, the blood from my nose now staining the floorboards. "You're a projection, a trick of the air." "If we aren't real, why is your house dying?" the boy asked. He began to walk across the ceiling toward the kitchen, his steps making the wood groan as if a heavy safe were being dragged across it. "Why is your blood so cold, Elias? Why is your routine so empty?" He reached the center of the room and dropped. He didn't fall. He descended, his body unfolding in midair until he landed silently on the carpet in front of me. The girl followed, landing right behind him. They stood there, two small figures in 1950s wool coats, blocking my path to the back door. The air around them was vibrating so fast it was creating a hum that made my teeth ache. The boy reached out a pale, thin hand. His fingers were too long, and they didn't have knuckles, just smooth, tapering flesh that ended in sharp black points. "The light is almost gone, Elias," he said. He pointed to the last lamp in the corner, the only one still struggling to stay lit. The bulb was flickering in a rhythmic pattern, short, long, short, SOS. "Once that goes out, the house is ours. But if you open the door now, if you let the rest of us in, we might leave a little bit of you behind, a memory of a routine, a ghost in the vents." I looked at the lamp. I looked at the boy. I realized that they weren't waiting for me to open the door because they couldn't get in. They were waiting for me to surrender the space. They needed me to acknowledge that the house was no longer mine. I tightened my grip on the skillet. "I've lived in this desert for 40 years, I whispered. "I've survived flash floods, scorpions, and the kind of silence that drives men mad. You think I'm afraid of a couple of shadows in Sunday suits?" The girl's face distorted, her jaw unhinged, her mouth opening wider and wider until it was a gaping black maw that took up half her face. "Then we will eat the silence. First," she shrieked. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a weight. It felt like being buried alive in a tomb of cold velvet. My heart was the only thing making noise now, a frantic, uneven drumming against my ribs that seemed to be the only thing keeping me from dissolving into the shadows. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I knew they were there, standing in the void, their black eyes invisible, but their hunger palpable. "It's so quiet now, Elias," the boy's voice whispered, seemingly from inside my own skull. "No more clanging, no more routine, just the long, beautiful cold." I felt a hand touch my cheek. It wasn't cold like ice, it was cold like the absence of heat. A vacuum that started to pull the warmth directly out of my skin. I felt my memories starting to flicker the face of my mother, the smell of the desert rain, the sound of my father's old truck. They were being deleted, one by one, replaced by a flat, gray static. I reached into my pocket. My fingers found the small brass Zippo lighter I'd carried since my days in the mines. It was a heavy, mechanical thing. Real. Solid. I didn't try to run. I didn't try to fight. I just struck the flint. Scritch. Scritch. A spark. Just a tiny orange spark in the middle of the infinite black. The children hissed, a sound like steam escaping a pressurized pipe. They recoiled, the small circle of orange light acting like a physical barrier. "The light is mine," I rasped, my voice sounding like breaking glass. "The house is mine. And the silence? The silence belongs to the desert, not to you." I struck it again. This time, the wick caught. A small, dancing flame bloomed in the center of the living room. In its flickering light, I saw them. They weren't children anymore. They were tall, thin columns of smoke like ash, their black eyes the only solid things about them. They were fading, their forms losing cohesion in the presence of a light they hadn't invited. "You can't hold it forever." The girl's voice trailed off, sounding like a dying radio signal. "The fuel will run out. Then I'll burn the house down with me in it," I said, my voice steady for the first time that night. "But you aren't getting the invitation." The shadows lunged, one last desperate surge of darkness. I held the lighter high, the flame burning my thumb, but I didn't let go. I didn't blink. I stared straight into the void until the void blinked first. With a sound like a heavy curtain being torn, the pressure snapped. The cold evaporated. The smell of soot and ozone vanished, replaced by the dry, dusty scent of Nevada sagebrush. I stood alone in my living room. The front door was closed, the bolt still thrown. The walls were just wood and plaster again, no longer looking like rotting bone. I sat in my armchair and watched that tiny flame until the fuel finally ran out. I sat in the dark for the rest of the night, listening to the wind. The sun rose over the Sierras, bleeding a deep, honest orange across the desert floor. I got up, made a cup of coffee, and performed my routine. I checked the perimeter, I checked the locks, but when I looked in the hallway mirror, I stopped. My hair, which had been salt and pepper the night before, was now a shocking snow white, and in the corner of my left eye, there was a tiny pinprick spot of absolute light-absorbing black. I went to my front porch to check the mail. There was nothing in the box, but as I turned to go back inside, I saw it. On the welcome mat sat a small, red plastic fire truck. It was identical to the one from the woods, but this one was covered in a fine, black dust that felt like soot. I picked it up. It was cold. I looked out toward the main road. Far in the distance, near the shimmering heat of the horizon, I saw two small figures in wool coats, standing side by side. They weren't moving. They were just watching. I didn't lock the door that night. I didn't need to. I realized then that they weren't trying to get in anymore. They were just waiting for me to finish the transformation. Because once you've looked into the void doesn't need an invitation. It just waits for you to forget how to keep the light burning. The last lamp exploded. Total darkness swallowed the room. "Please, Elias," she whispered. "The dark is so heavy. Let us share yours."